Bienvenidos a Futuro Público, un podcast para profundizar el debate sobre innovación en el sector público.
Hola amigos, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos a Futuro Público. Soy José Díaz y en el episodio de hoy vamos a conversar sobre el Digital Identity Wallet o billetera digital de la Unión Europea y lo que podemos aprender de su implementación y las perspectivas desde migrantes y poblaciones vulnerables. Para ello tenemos a 3 investigadoras, las 3 viviendo y estudiando en Alemania, una costarricense, una alemana y una de Líbano. Las 3 estuvieron a cargo de esta importante investigación que forma parte de un proyecto mayor sobre identidad digital e inclusiva, la cual fue comisionada por Caribou Digital. Ahora sí, vamos con nuestras invitadas. Ana Werkstetter Caravaca, ella es costarricense y es doctora de Ciencias Políticas para la Universidad Libre de Berlín. Su trabajo explora la geopolítica del conocimiento y el poder y actualmente coordina On the Right Track, que es una alianza estratégica entre movimientos feministas de Europa y América Latina que se oponen a los movimientos antigénero y antiderechos. Marianne Samaha, de Líbano, es investigadora y profesional que se encuentra entre Berlín y Beirut. Ha trabajado extensamente con ONGs locales e internacionales y ha gestionado programas humanitarios y de desarrollo en la región del sudeste asiático y el norte de África. Su investigación aborda temas de migración, el asilo, el género y la interseccionalidad. Y ella es doctora en Relaciones Internacionales por la Universidad Libre de Berlín. Y también tenemos a Thea Kirsch. Ella es alemana, politóloga que reside en Berlín y se especializa en la intersección de la migración, la tecnología y la gobernanza de la innovación, con especial atención a la biometría, la identificación digital y otras tecnologías centradas en el usuario o ciudadano digitalizado. Su trabajo de doctorado en la Freie Universität Berlin y la Universidad de Humboldt se centra en redes transnacionales de expertos y en la producción de conocimiento en torno a la biometría. Vale decir que este episodio será grabado en inglés y en español y los transcripts serán compartidos junto con el episodio. Ahora sí, welcome Thea, Marianne, and Ana. Thanks for being here with us in Futuro Público. This is one of our few episodes in English. This is actually both in English and Spanish. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having us, Jose.
Yeah, thank you so much that it's okay that we speak English.
Thank you, Jose.
Great. So I understand that you were commissioned, the 3 of you were commissioned to research on this very particular and also very interesting topic of the digital wallet, specifically for the case of the European Union digital identification wallet. Perhaps if you can tell me what is the wallet, and let's start from there.
Yeah, of course. Happy to speak about that. The European Digital Identity Wallet, or for short, it's also known as EUDI Wallet. It's a mobile application that, if everything goes as planned, will be available starting early 2027. And it's an application that will be available, or is supposed to be available, for all EU citizens and residents. It's something that features very prominently in the European Union strategy for digitalization, for the digital single market, and also in the EU's conception of taking on the role of digital leadership, kind of in the global context. And it's interesting to see, or maybe important to note, that there is one overarching vision for this European Digital Identity Wallet that is going to enable its users to safely store personal information, share it in a user-controlled, privacy-preserving way. But there will be several wallets. So each member state's is required to provide at least one wallet, and to ensure interoperability between these different wallets, they are built to the same technical standards, following the same technological specifications.
Great. So you've put on the table several buzzwords of the digital world, like digital sovereignty, also the wallet itself, like e-registration. How can all of these connect also to the digitalization agenda, right? And how does it all connect and around the digitalization agenda across Europe and perhaps in the specific case of Germany, and also how it has to do with the European regulation?
Yeah, so the EUDI Wallet, the EUDI Wallet, is it results from the EIDAS 2.0 regulation, which already tells us, of course, there was a 1.0, which goes back to the early 2010s. And already 15 years ago, there was this goal in the European Union to ensure that people in the EU have access to digital services and offers across countries, across EU member states in an easy way. So this was the very kind of like the where it all started. This is the origin story of the EUDI Wallet. And this is when you then connect it to Germany, of course, something that is at the top of the agenda in Germany. This question of how can we bring government services into the 21st century? How can we make sure that people have it easy and can kind of decide whether they want to do it in an offline or an online way when they interact with the government, but also with private industry. So this is where the EUDI Wallet comes from. And yeah, as I said, it's a European project, but it also ties in with the different goals and values that each of the member states pursues. And that kind of comes through or shines through in the way how the different EU member states are developing their wallets.
And I think one of the main features that also you've mentioned, like the entry point, is that you have to be a citizen, right? And if that's the case, or a resident, a legal resident, how can the wallet could serve non-EU residents or newcomers, for example?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. When you think about this new initiative, I think it's important to understand that the European Union is building a new type of ecosystem here, a new type of identity ecosystem. And of course, the question then is who has access to that ecosystem and how is access to that ecosystem facilitated? So with the EUDI Wallet, there is a core set of reference data, of personal information data that users can issue or have it issued into the wallet. And this is derived from an electronic means of identification issued by a member state. So for sure, there is this aspect of you have to be known and kind of recognized by EU member state in order to be onboarded or in order to enter this new and emerging ecosystem. That is for sure people who have the EU citizenship, the citizenship of one of the EU member states, but also people who have a legal a residence title, which could, of course, be anyone from outside the EU. So to that extent, the EUDI Wallet is also meant to include people from outside the European Union. I think the really difficult question in this context, though, is sometimes it can be really hard, or at least that's something that we've seen in the case of Germany. Sometimes it can be really hard for people to settle in a new country, to arrive on a visa and then get all of the papers in order to get settled into their new everyday life. And this is where we see in our research a gap where maybe people will not be able to very easily benefit from the EUDI Wallet if existing systems are kind of challenging to navigate, because for sure the EUDI Wallet, even though it is a new tool, it's a new innovation, it is very dependent on everything that is out there in terms of social structures and systems.
Thank you for this explanation, Thea. Just a last question from my end will be regarding the opportunities to shape the debate. You have mentioned, the technical aspect, but also some important considerations when it comes to citizenship, to being a legally resident person. So how's the debate being shaped by the topic of the wallet, especially now that again there's a strong focus on migrants and integration in Germany and across Europe?
Yeah, I think, and Ana and Marianne will talk about that more in a second, I'm sure about that. But it's important to see that there are several sides to this debate, right? Because in Germany, on the one hand, there's a very strong focus or a perceived need to get skilled migrants, to get them coming to Germany. And there is quite an advanced policy debate around how to facilitate people's arrival, their recruitment. So the EUDI Wallet fits into that discussion. But of course, it's important to remember that every time, in whatever country, in whatever context, we introduce a new identity tool, a new means of identification, such as the EUDI Wallet, we are renegotiating this question of who's in and who's out. So for sure, it's important to keep an eye on this and to critically ask how, through the wallet, these boundaries are redrawn. And this is something that we've tried to investigate with our research.
Really interesting insights, Thea. With this technical framework of who's in, who's out, and what comes next, let's now shift focus a bit towards the research. And here, Marianne, to you, from the migrant perspectives, and you being a migrant yourself, why this is important? Why the topic of identification, touch points, marginalization, or why also the topic of different legal situations? Why it is important to talk about this in the context of the digital wallet?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we think of identity documents, we think of obviously like ID cards, passports, student IDs, employee IDs, library cards, health insurance cards, driving licenses, and so on. So there's so many documents that really organize our lives, our everyday lives. They determine our mobility, our access to certain spaces. They really determine mostly really our rights as residents. And we use these documents really every day as citizens, of course, and Thea talked about this earlier, as residents, as travelers, as customers, students, and so on and so forth. We see that increasingly these identification processes are becoming digitalized. And when we're thinking also about the last few years, we see that specifically government services are also being increasingly available online. At the same time, there is a lack of information about how migrants experience these systems. Like particularly when we're thinking about Germany, for instance, how do migrants really experience these different identification processes over the different stages where they're arriving in Germany and their lives in Germany? So that is a major gap that we know very little about. But also, I think that like as we're thinking about the EUDI wallet, building on existing infrastructures, for example, we know that there is a risk that some people will be left behind. And in that case, that would be migrants and other vulnerable communities. So we feel that it's very important for migrants' experiences of the current system to be really researched, to be understood in order for it to influence the future in that sense. And now is the time to do that because we're talking about this design phase at the moment, and usually this sort of feedback should be present at the design phase because later on during implementation, it would be really, really hard to integrate. Maybe one last thing that I would say regarding this is that we also know that obviously migrants experience different challenges, unrelated. When we're thinking about it, like it might seem unrelated actually to identification or to digitalization. But then when we look at the challenges that they face in housing, health benefits, etc., when we're looking at them really closely, we can understand how linked also they are to their identification documents and to the digitalization process. So it's really important to understand the status quo before moving on to further development and further innovation. So that's why in our research, we really wanted to center the perspectives of migrants to understand their lived experiences of the current ecosystem in Germany. And while complementing that with interviews and conversations with some experts. So we spoke to a number of migrants with different nationalities. The reason why we chose different nationalities is that sometimes procedures actually change depending on the person's nationality, procedures and treatment. But also we chose people with different legal statuses. So we spoke to people with a student residence permit, a work residence permit, an EU blue card as skilled workers. We spoke to people with a convention refugee status, a temporary protection status, in addition to asylum seekers and toleration holders or Duldung holders. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Marianne. In fact, this really is a multidimensional journey. I can already see all the different layers coming together around the topic of the wallet. But migrants are just part of the picture, one part of the picture, right? When we look at the broader ecosystem here, there's more actors. What's the role of and the position of these actors, but specifically those who build and implement these technologies? Let's say fintech, startups, experts. Are they aware about these journeys and the lived experiences, and are they aware like how can they integrate these, with within the current legal and technical frameworks required for the wallet?
Maybe I can speak to that. For people working in the digital identity sector, I would say that there is a certain degree of awareness around user journeys, as we would call it in kind of tech jargon. But for sure, and also as Marianne has highlighted just now, the question is who's at the center of the imaginations of the people who are developing, who are designing the technology when they think of the user, right? And I think there is a tendency that certain groups fall through the cracks and are easily, maybe not forgotten, but tend to get sidelined and to say, at least they are not centered. So in that regard, the approach that we took in our research and also the questions that we asked the digital industry experts really took a different approach, because we came from that perspective. And certainly in many conversations we heard that for the experts themselves, some of the information that we shared, it was new for them, and it kind of reminded them of the importance of thinking about a broad variety of user groups and their different needs.
Thank you, Thea, for this clarification. In fact, I find really interesting this sentence that you dropped about who's at the center of the imagination, right? For as user, as a person who's gonna make use of this wallet. Marianne, coming back to you, maybe we can talk about these challenges, precisely the challenges of the migrants as users for the digital wallet.
Yeah, I think that like one of the main findings that we have in this report is that when we're trying to ask migrants questions about digitalization in general or about the EUDI wallet in specific, we always go back to challenges that are perhaps not seen as directly related to that, which actually makes us understand how linked social rights and services, how linked they are actually to this whole digitalization debate. So in terms of challenges, and obviously these are different from one group to the other, but I do think that a lot of these challenges are common with German citizens. They might be common with certain disadvantaged groups among citizens. Some of these challenges might be more exacerbated for some people, for example, with more precarious legal statuses versus people with more maybe legal statuses, that have perhaps more durability or are more sustainable in Germany. So these can differ, but most of these challenges were mentioned by a large majority of people that we spoke to. They talked to us about delays in terms of paperwork, in terms of verifying paperwork, identities, etc. So really a lot of delays in terms of verification and authentication by the administration in Germany. We also heard about a lot of unclear or inconsistent administrative requirements. So there's a lot of confusion about what is required from people, because sometimes one document can be required for one person, but then another document when another person is applying. So there's a lot of confusion about that. We heard also about some discriminatory and arbitrary bureaucratic processes, especially in cases where the law is unclear or when the law is broad. One of the things that kept on coming up among migrants was the issue with language and communication. We know that there's been a lot of effort in terms of translating some websites or providing translation, but this remains really a major issue in terms of being able to communicate with bureaucrats, but also understanding the requirements in terms of paperwork and more generally identification requirements when everything is written in German, but for people who have just arrived, this might be actually a hurdle to understand and communicate. We also heard about a big reliance in Germany on physical documentation. There's also a lot of duplication of efforts and document submission. So sometimes like the same document is required several times among like several submissions. Some people talk to us also about differential treatment depending on the country of origin, for instance, which is what I mentioned also earlier. There's a lot of delays in finding appointments and a lot of challenges with the appointments system online when it is available. There's quite some significant dependency on solidarity networks among migrants, and that is due to the limited availability of information online. So people have to rely on solidarity networks to know their rights, for example. More general issues also relating to the housing situation, but then they also link to digital identities in a sense, because everything in Germany is based on getting an Anmeldung or a registration of your address. And that could be quite challenging actually for some people to do, like first because of the challenges that we know of in Germany in terms of housing, but also then the challenges relating to finding an appointment to do the Anmeldung and so on, and how everything is related to this appointment and to having this paper that proves that someone has housing. We know also that depending on the state, some migrants can have limited access to healthcare, because when it comes to access to healthcare, the law can be different from one German state to another. There's a lot of delays also in receiving social benefits, specifically for asylum seekers and refugees. One major issue that was also raised across migrants, actually, and this was raised by EU blue card holders, for example, but also among people with a refugee status, is that the limited recognition of credentials. So a lot of people come to Germany with diplomas, like a master's degree or a BA or other, but then it's very difficult to have these diplomas recognized through the system. And a lot of people have to see their experience devalued, actually, and their diplomas devalued in order to be able to work in Germany. We also know of a lot of undocumented migrants experiencing restricted access to SIM cards, also to financial services, because financial services are not made available for everyone. They are made available depending on one's legal status and hence their identification documents. There's also limitations on mobility depending on one's identification documents. And then maybe one last thing that I would talk about, and that links very closely to digitalization, and that is that a lot of people are very confused about existing EID services. So there are some EID services that do exist, but a lot of people feel very confused about them. Either they do not know about them, or when they do know, they don't know how to tackle them or how to navigate them. So how does one get, for example, an electronic ID in Germany? That was a question that was asked many times by people who we were talking to, especially when we would mention, there's the EID system at the moment. Have you tried it? And for a lot of people, the answer was, does it really exist really? Like, how does that work? So this really shows how much confusion there is about existing services, but also to really summarize what I was saying before, the link between access to social services and identification documents, and hence the link to digitalization in that sense.
Really interesting, Marianne. Thanks for this overview. In fact, I was reflecting on how do people navigate this system while you were giving us all of this picture, especially now that digitalization, in Europe, but also in Germany, is limited, and even more when it comes to migrants, right? It seems that they will need to navigate a double burden, the offline analog bureaucratic system, and also the digital one, which is partially implemented. Like, what's at stake there?
Yeah, for a lot of people at the moment, especially for those who don't have support networks around them, some of the available services are really not accessible for these people. So that's why I think later on, and I think Ana can talk more about that, one of the suggestions that we make is to actually make available not just a digital way of doing things, but also like a paper way of doing things for those who don't have access actually to these systems. But overall, I feel that there's a lot of people who are experiencing limitations on their rights, limitations on their mobility, etc., because of their limited knowledge in terms of how to use these services. Or their inability actually to use them, because a lot of these services also actually assume that people have certain documents, and very often with migrants, certain documents that are maybe common knowledge or that are like absolutely there or obvious for a German citizen. Actually, it is not the case for migrants. So this leaves people with limited access to certain rights and limited access to certain services that might be then more accessible for German citizens.
Is it okay if I just add to that?
Yes, go ahead, Thea.
Because I think, Marianne, what you just said, like it highlighted so well the different struggles that people are facing. And it's interesting when you think back to how the idea of the EUDI Wallet originated, and that it really is targeted at kind of lightening, reducing the mental load that people have to carry when they travel, when they migrate across borders. But the thing is, as it is a European regulation, it's really targeted at people who are already inside the European system. So, for example, if you have a Spanish citizenship and you have the Spanish wallet, the future vision of this emerging ecosystem is that it would be interoperable with German services. So potentially making it easier to come to Germany for your Erasmus semester, to work here, for different purposes. But so this also really shows you that whereas the idea, the good intentions around the wallet might be there, it becomes more complicated when people don't fit the user, as we already talked about it, that was at the center of the considerations.
Interesting perspective there. And here we are talking about the status quo itself, right? And when we zoom out a little bit from the picture of migrants, because you were mentioning, the European citizens in general, what's the general perception of people regarding the EU digital identity, the wallet?
Yeah, maybe actually just to add also one thing to what Thea said earlier, I think it's also in a sense like these sort of complications have real impact on people's lives. They have impact on how long they wait, for example, inside procedures, how long they wait for their residence permits, for example, to be issued. They have an impact on their work contracts as well. These are just examples. So I can think of, for example, a case of a person who, let's say, found a job and they are in a situation to apply for their work permit or for their EU blue card. But then they find themselves in a situation where the recognition of their credentials in their home country is taking a very, very long time, which can actually put at risk their ability to sign the contract with the company where they found a job, but also it might put at risk their ability to stay in Germany as well, or to continue residing in the country. So yeah, just to add that example actually to your question about like how can we actually explain the impact more in like real life stories as well. Regarding the perceptions about digitalization or the EUDI, when we were asking migrants, or at least like the people that we interviewed, some questions about that, we heard actually a lot of concerns about digitalization in general and about the EUDI. But we also heard some encouraging words, I think, where some people feel that it can be an opportunity. In terms of concerns, I mean, obviously there are concerns over data protection and location tracking, and this was particularly a challenge that some people mentioned, especially people with a more precarious status, a precarious legal status. There was also a concern around the validity of physical documents over digital ones. There's a lot of confusion currently with some digital services, for example, whether it is the physical document that is valid or the digital one in that sense. And there are concerns over that continuing in the future. People also talked about the misuse of AI. And there's some stories also about that in the last period, I think, in Europe. And And there's, as I said before, a lot of confusion about the existing EID services, but also some fear that any digitalization effort would instead deepen exclusion instead of actually making things better for migrants. At the same time, we heard also some encouraging words in that sense, where for some people, digitalization was an opportunity. And I can think of particularly, for example, we heard that from people who have an EU blue card, or, for example, Ukrainians who have temporary protection in Germany. And the experience of Ukrainians might actually connect to digitalization in Ukraine or their current use of the Dia app. Actually, this could be an assumption that we connected it to, because they really talked about how the Dia app facilitated some of the processes that they went through as they were coming to Germany and as they were fleeing Ukraine. But yeah, we had a lot of points about making the case for digitalization, or talking about how digitalization can be an opportunity for migrants. So, as I said, like, some people reported positive experience with other apps like the Dia app, or even actually some people talked about their insurance apps like being really a good example of what digitalization can look like. Some people also said that maybe digitalization can be the opportunity for having more streamlined processes and more efficiency in administrative processes. Some people also talked about how it can be more secure for some of their documents, because when everybody is relying on physical documents, and particularly in terms of identification, there's always a risk that these documents might be lost or that they could be damaged. And there was also a lot of discussion about cost reduction and whether digitalization can actually help with reducing the cost for migrants. And then finally, talking a lot about minimizing inequalities and differential treatment, because then people are not always interacting with a person. In that sense, unfortunately, that was actually one of the most recurring arguments around minimizing inequalities with digitalization. But then also how when things are happening through an app, then we can have more enhanced inclusivity, because people then can communicate, or can, if the app is multilingual, then can communicate with their language or in a language that is common to a large number of people.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Thea, Marianne y Ana, por consolidar estos puntos. De hecho, han mencionado algo súper importante sobre el concepto de diseño centrado en el usuario, que específicamente no debe reducirse a una consulta de usuario por default, sino que debe ser un principio operacional que modele estos procesos de diseño digital. Aquí, de hecho, me quedo con la idea que esto pues resulta interesante porque expande el concepto de usuario más allá del ciudadano en sí mismo. Lo dirige específicamente hacia la persona, hacia el ser humano, si lo quieren poner en ese modo, independientemente de su estatus. Ana, ¿qué nos puedes comentar sobre esto?
Sí, mira, José, exactamente eso es parte de nuestro enfoque de investigación, y parte de, por así decir, la recomendación amplia de nuestro estudio, que es básicamente que no se puede entender un sistema solo viendo a un lado, sino que hay que verlo cómo son las interacciones entre los diferentes sistemas, cómo una innovación digital en una área puede cambiar el sistema y tener consecuencias que a lo mejor no son entendidas antes de implementar estos cambios. Por lo tanto, vemos que las experiencias de los migrantes y de las personas que ya sufren las consecuencias de los fallos del sistema nos pueden verdaderamente alertar de dónde se necesitan hacer innovaciones para crear verdaderamente una herramienta digital que empodere a todos. Por lo tanto, no se trata solamente de tener la perspectiva de personas migrantes, aunque este ha sido nuestro enfoque, sino que con responder a esas necesidades también respondemos a las necesidades de otras poblaciones que también son ciudadanos, que también tienen riesgos de ser marginalizados en el sistema. Entonces, como se ha podido apreciar en nuestro enfoque de investigación y en nuestras conclusiones, tenemos esta perspectiva sistémica, al igual que en nuestras recomendaciones. Nosotros analizamos el contexto actual, los aspectos que funcionan y los que no funcionan, para poder dar verdaderamente recomendaciones que hablen sobre el diseño inclusivo de la billetera europea, pero también de los procesos de digitalización de migración y asilo y la intersección de la política social con la identidad digital y la digitalización.
Claro, en efecto, todo esta mirada global es súper interesante. Si puedes puntualizar un poco más sobre las conclusiones o específicamente las recomendaciones de el análisis y si además puedes extenderlas eso un poco hacia estos procesos más generales, ¿no? De precisamente lo que has mencionado, de cómo integrar otras perspectivas, además más allá de la migrante, dentro de estos procesos de diseño de tecnología.
Ujú. Claro. Obviamente nosotros estamos hablando del contexto alemán, pero sí tenemos recomendaciones que vemos que se pueden generalizar a otros contextos y que pueden ser relevantes para personas implementando este tipo de herramienta digital en otros contextos. Uno de los aspectos muy importantes que tal vez se escucha un poco básico, pero que no se puede tomar por dado, es hacer que la identificación digital sea sencilla, segura, inclusiva. Para hacer esto, lo más importante es la comunicación. En este momento, mucha gente no tiene ni idea de lo que realmente es una billetera digital. Si no se explica con claridad, no pueden verdaderamente entender por qué usarla. Por lo tanto, se trata de verdad acercar estas herramientas a la gente, explicarles en un lenguaje sencillo, utilizando imágenes, videos, hacerlo también en muchos idiomas. En el contexto alemán es muy común que solo sea disponible en inglés o en alemán, pero también debería ser disponible en muchos otros idiomas que también son hablados por tantos migrantes como ciudadanos en este país. Particularmente la información sobre derechos, solicitudes y servicios debe estar disponible en tantos idiomas como sea posible o relevante en el contexto. Parte de la comunicación es también comunicar de manera clara los usos de la billetera digital, o sea, cuáles son los casos de uso. Muchos migrantes compartieron, por ejemplo, conocer la opción en Alemania del Ausweis App, una aplicación digital para identificarse, pero que no entendían para qué usarla, ni cómo activarla, no entendían qué tanto acceso tendría a sus datos, entonces terminan rechazándola porque no saben para qué usarla. Y bueno, esto también trae la cuestión de confianza. Se entiende muy bien que sobre todo poblaciones que ya tienen experiencias de marginalización dentro de una sociedad sean cautelosas con la identificación digital, no quieren que sus datos personales circulen libremente. Por lo tanto, implementadores tienen que demostrarle a los usuarios que su información está protegida y que siempre tienen el control sobre qué informaciones comparten. Por ejemplo, en Ucrania ya se usa desde hace tiempo una aplicación que se llama Thea App, y las entrevistas que conocimos aquí con personas de Ucrania que han venido a Alemania bajo el estatus de protección especial debido a la guerra, nos han hablado específicamente del nivel de confianza que tienen ellos sobre cómo sus datos están siendo protegidos. Esto se puede hacer reduciendo el riesgo de compartir información en exceso, utilizar señales visuales claras en el interfaz de la cartera, por ejemplo, una marca verde para las solicitudes de datos autorizadas y una marca roja para las que no se autorizan, a fin de ayudar a los usuarios a comprender qué datos están apropiados para compartir en un servicio determinado. Otra recomendación amplia que tenemos, que también es aplicable en otros contextos, es conectar la identidad digital con la vida real. Como ya mencioné, la verdad es que las personas solo adoptan la tecnología cuando significa algo para ellas. Si la EUDI Wallet es solo otra aplicación, no va a ser nada, no va a servir, no va a ser utilizada. Pero si realmente facilita la vida, por ejemplo, para matricular a los hijos a la escuela, acceder a servicios sociales, utilizarla para viajar, entonces sí es una herramienta de empoderamiento y sí va a ser adoptada también por los usuarios. Para que eso suceda, la cartera debe admitir casos de usos reales y prácticos, cosas que las personas necesitan y hacen todos los días. Aunque la interoperabilidad más allá de las fronteras es todavía un tema desafiante, estos servicios deben funcionar a lo largo de todos los países e instituciones. Así que si te mudas de Alemania a Bélgica, por ejemplo, que tus credenciales puedan viajar contigo, la interoperabilidad, que la cartera funcione en diferentes plataformas, en dispositivos, contextos, también debería ir más allá del ecosistema de la Unión Europea. Se trata realmente de crear un sistema de identidad digital que sea fluido, flexible, que se pueda usar como el pasaporte o tarjeta de crédito y que se pueda confiar de él donde se vaya en el mundo, no solo en Europa. Y finalmente, hablamos sobre la necesidad de hacer la digitalización una herramienta de empoderamiento y no de exclusión. Esto es especialmente importante cuando hablamos del sistema de migración y asilo. La transformación digital puede hacer que los servicios públicos sean más rápidos y fáciles de usar, como tener un lugar en línea para reservar citas, subir documentos o comprobar el estado de solicitud. Muchas veces, muchos migrantes nos reportan que, por ejemplo, no tienen idea de qué está pasando con su solicitud. No tienen cómo acceder a esa información y eso causa mucha incertidumbre y tiene efectos materiales en la vida de las personas, claro. Por eso un sistema así solo funciona si es verdaderamente accesible y responde a las necesidades de las personas. Eso también significa invertir en alfabetización digital, formación tanto para los usuarios como para el personal de las instituciones que implementan estas herramientas y diseñar de una manera que sea intuitiva para usuarios que tal vez no tienen el mismo nivel de acceso a herramientas digitales que tal vez se asume del usuario promedio. También la inteligencia artificial tiene un rol aquí. Puede acelerar mucho el trabajo administrativo, pero claramente debe utilizarse de forma responsable, especialmente en áreas tan sensibles como son la gestión de fronteras o los trámites de asilo. Y por último, uno de los puntos que nosotros le ponemos mucho énfasis es que estos procesos de consultación no pueden ser solo para hacer como check, hicimos una consulta, sino que de verdad deben ser una parte fundacional del proceso. Y entonces, parte de poder asegurar que haya un acompañamiento de estas poblaciones que ya tienen experiencias de marginalización en la sociedad es darle tiempo y fondos a las organizaciones de base y dirigidas por migrantes, por ejemplo, como para que ellos puedan ser verdaderamente socios esenciales en todo este proceso. Ellos son las personas que conocen bien a sus comunidades, pueden ser los puentes entre la política y las personas reales. Apoyarlos e involucrarlos hace que la transformación digital no solamente sea eficiente, sino que también sea justa y humana.
Great. Thank you very much, the three of you, Thea, Marianne, Ana, again for being with us in this special episode of Futuro Público. What I take from all this long conversation that we just had is that innovation and digitalization comes with intentionality, right? And this intentionality needs to be accompanied by inclusive design, real participatory process, not overlooking anyone as part of this process. Otherwise, there's a lot of on the table, a lot of risks from politicization to invisibilization to many others. And thank you very much for all the insights and the learnings.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you for hosting us and for the conversation.
Bueno amigos, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. Esto fue un episodio más de Futuro Público. No se olviden que pueden seguirnos en futuropublico.org e igualmente buscarnos como Futuro Público en LinkedIn, Spotify y YouTube. Ya estamos preparando los próximos episodios y queremos saber cuál es su opinión como usuarios de billeteras o identificación digitales. ¿Cómo creen que estas aplicaciones pueden mejorar? Escríbanos, cuéntenos. Gracias por escucharnos y hasta la próxima. Chao.